Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. I faced a choice this morning biking here to visit you in Santa Monica from Koreatown. I could take a lot of different ways, but Wilshire Boulevard or Venice Boulevard was the question in my mind. What different city experiences would I get choosing one over the other? Venice Boulevard, Wilshire Boulevard.
Well, I should ask you because you did the bike ride, yes. Not me.
I chose Venice, by the way.
So you said. Venice to me would be the express route, would be the Route 5 instead of Route 101, if I were going to San Francisco. I have spent a lot of time driving back and forth to San Francisco over the years because I have family. And it's always interesting because you have three choices, 101, and 5. And the mental process of selecting the route beforehand, I think is one that people use in cities all the time, even not unconsciously or just in a very kind of rapid way. We're constantly choosing our paths. Mm-hmm. And it's always a series of trade-offs. Do I have a lot of time? Do I want the scenic route where I can wander and see things? Do I want to get there the fastest possible way? Mm-hmm. So one of the things, I don't want to reduce the complexity and beauty of cities to a formula in any way, but two guideposts we've always had is the idea of path and place. Mm-hmm. So much of what we do, we realize, falls on the watershed one side or the other. Mm-hmm. It's either more focused on path or place, and it's as fundamental a difference as walking versus sitting. Mm. So Wilshire versus Venice. Venice is an old streetcar line, and a diagonal cutting across the grid, doing great damage as it crosses the grid, creating incredibly complicated geometric intersections because it's doing its best to get the train as fast as possible to the beach. Mm. That's Venice Boulevard. That's its history. It was one of these old boulevards with an amusement park at the end. It's one of these paths that is all about the goodies at the end of the line. And there's a parkway in suburban New York called the Rye Parkway, Playland Parkway, sorry, it's in Rye, New York. And at the end of Playland Parkway is Playland on the beach. And Venice was like that for Venice Boulevard. Wilshire is just an entirely different kind of street, entirely different history, pieced together. Now it connects downtown to Santa Monica, but that was really happenstance. And so, of course, it's a much more varied, complex, changeable street than Venice. And this is just as I'm imagining it sitting here with you. On a bike, I can't imagine. Venice clearly has a bike lane, although I take it a little scary because the speeds on Venice.
We have lines on the ground in Los Angeles. We don't have bike lanes. Let's correct that.
It's certainly not a separated lane. Wilshire would be interesting on a bike, but I wouldn't want to be in a hurry. So many crossing streets, and I would bet that the number of intersections on the route between Koreatown and here and Wilshire was perhaps twice as many as Venice.
It is true, and there's many other factors to work in. Of course, there's interesting things on the way on both of those, but if you're just talking pure expediency, you're talking pure conditions, I think, do I want to deal with the glass on the ground on Venice or the cracked pavement on Wilshire?
Well, if you're really talking expediency, you're going to get off the boulevards altogether and get on the freeway. At least that was always
not on a bike. I'm
not on a bike. But if we're talking just about pathways in general and concepts of movement in cities, that was the idea. And we'll talk, I'm sure, about the difference between the freeways and the boulevards, which is a fundamental kind of challenge and characteristic of LA is this back and forth between these two very different systems of movement.
In any case, I did make it here to Santa Monica, where on Notebook on Cities and Culture today, I sit down with Doug Suisman, who is the founder and principal at Suisman Urban Design and the author of the newly reissued in its 25th anniversary edition, Los Angeles Boulevard, 8 X-rays of the Body Public, which many Los Angeles architecture and built environment fans and architecture students and urban planning students are very excited, I'm sure, to finally be able to get again in an edition with new material as well. Back before the first edition, though, even, what do you remember about how boulevards first fascinated you here, or which ones did after you got here?
Well, when I got here in '83, that was after 2 years in Paris, the sort of granddaddy of the boulevards, and then in 6 years in New York, which had, of course, avenues and boulevards of a very different character. And so I had this idea of what a vibrant urban street was, and then I came out here and I'd read Rainer Banham's book, Los Angeles, the Architecture of Four Ecologies, and of course I dedicated LA Boulevard to Banham in his book because it was so wonderful and influential on my thinking and really actually influenced me to move here. And when I got out, I'd read about these boulevards. I'd been to LA years before, but I really didn't know the city at all. And I was expecting this kind of vibrancy, these exciting boulevards, Sunset Boulevard. And I remember being kind of fascinated and kind of disappointed. They were very interesting, but there wasn't that sense of life on them that I had expected.
As in, there weren't people walking around, simply stated?
Simply stated, people walking around was the barometer. That was simply the measure. The closer you got to the center of the big city, the more people are walking around, and all of the feelings and experiences that tends to generate against the backdrop of architecture and structure and urban form. And it was very different. It was, Banham, of course, famously said, that he, in order to read LA, he learned to drive a car. He felt that was the way you read LA. I mean, what's marvelous now, 31 years later, is that really that's changing. And the car is certainly no longer the only way to read LA, and I would say probably not the best way. It's still a way, but it's very, very different. And I think that's exciting and encouraging and is going to sets LA in a very good direction for growth.
What characteristics of the Los Angeles Boulevard hopped out at you, other than there's not a lot of people on them when you first saw them? I mean, there's that, but that itself is not particularly interesting unless combined with what? What else did you notice?
Well, yes, not interesting. I mean, unless you don't think sad is interesting. I do. There was a sort of, as I wrote in the book, there was a sort of sense of abandonment. There was all these indicators of intense human activity, tall buildings, billboards screaming, lots of vehicles moving, lots of movement. But where you expected human beings to be in large numbers, they were gone. So there was almost a sense of abandonment, as if something had been here and was no longer. And as I studied the history of the city and the boulevards, in fact, there had been something. There had been boulevards, the same boulevards, in many sections actually filled with people, and streetcars, and a lot of cars as well. There was just a different mix. So it wasn't the notion that the sort of the myth, I think, the prejudice that LA was the city of cars, I think was damaging and really not true. It certainly was a major factor, but only a factor of a certain period in LA's history. And so my studies of what came before was to help me see the current period in an historic continuum and recognize, wait a minute, just because we've given over the city predominantly to the needs of drivers and cars and parking and travel lanes doesn't mean it was always that way. And if it wasn't always that way, it may not always need to be. And so that set the basis for what at the time seemed like a pretty quixotic enterprise, which was to try and rethink what the boulevards could become again.
It's a question that comes up in my mind a lot, which is, yes, there's this impression that everybody is familiar with. The farther outside of Los Angeles you are, the more vivid the impression becomes of Los Angeles as a car-dominated city, a city meant for the car, built for the car, I mean, even more incorrectly. Why does Los Angeles have that bad rap when, I mean, admittedly, there's a lot of cars here, but Phoenix, Houston, Dallas, I mean, Milwaukee, Orlando, you can name so many cities in America where it's definitely worse in terms of actually being built specifically for the automobile. Do you know what I mean? Why Los Angeles? Why here is this the one that's the whipping boy?
Well, and you could add, Milan or the outskirts of Barcelona or...
I've heard Milan is cool, though.
Oh, great. No, it's Central City, but I think what's shocking to most people is that so much of supposedly LA's characteristics as a car city has been exported to cities around the world, particularly in the outer rings.
Look at French cities. My God, it's worse.
Exactly. In some ways, it's worse. Why did LA get that reputation? Well, I think it did it had to do with timing more than anything else. I think the period of growth in LA coincided with the arrival of the car and really the first idea of separating roadways from the ground, the first freeways, the first grade separated roadways. It wasn't the first time people had thought about it, but it was the first time that a city started to build in a kind of systematic way. It coincided with the technology that allowed us to do it in terms of concrete and steel, with the vehicles that could handle those speeds, with a political and historic moment when the federal government, under Eisenhower, allocated lots of money for these roadways, which were seen as an important defense priority, and with the federal government's policy of subsidizing returning veterans from World War II for suburban housing. All those, this has been much studied and much written about, but there was a combination of factors just at a moment when LA's population was exploding or continuing to explode. And therefore it did become the poster child for that kind of urbanism. I think the smog that was generated, which came from the cars, but was really made worse by the unique topography, all made for a kind of great story. Dirty city, tinsel town, i.e. the light is the sparkle in the tinsel, but the dark is the pollution from the cars. And it made for a very kind of noirish picture of LA that made a good story. And I suppose just from a quantitative point of view, we probably did build more freeway miles per capita than any other city. Don't know that for sure. But for all those reasons, LA became the symbol of this new kind of city, for better or for worse. For me, the interesting thing was not the highways. There were highways in the cities where I'd lived, in New York certainly. Look at what Moses did in New York. But the highways, in some ways, were intended, whether they did or not, to then relieve the pressure on the urban avenues and boulevards so that they could continue to be great places for people. What I saw in LA that was so disappointing was not the freeways. The freeways were fine. They were pressure relief valves. They got the cars. The idea was they'd get the cars off the streets. The disappointment was the boulevards, which themselves seemed to be in the process of conversion to a kind of freeway-like composition. That was where the battle was for me. The freeways were fine as an elevated urban system. They did, for people having to go long distances, they had a very important function, like the subway system in New York. It's very important that we have multiple systems of pathways, a hierarchy of pathways, and the freeways, whatever the problems with pollution and so forth and congestion, was certainly a system that seemed to make a lot of sense at that time. The question is, what did it then allow you to get in terms of the quality of urban space and urban life on the boulevards? And that was where the disappointment was.
Because you'd think, you've anticipated a question that I would ask here, which is, great, the freeways are up now, the cars can concentrate on the freeways, and the boulevards can be more about things that aren't cars, but the freeways just gave the boulevards an excuse to become more freeway-like?
Well, I think what really happened, I think, is that the freeways were not enough very quickly. As we know, as soon as you build them, they tend to fill to capacity. And you couldn't build freeways fast enough or far enough to meet the demand, so that it just became an expedient to look at the boulevards as extensions of the freeways. And because of the sheer extent of the city, the sprawl, really limited only by the mountains, and even then, the mountains proved not to be an insuperable barrier. The sprawl made it almost impossible to catch up to the geographical spread with a public transit service that could serve them quickly. Now, one of the biggest mistakes I hear again and again is LA doesn't have transit. And
again, something you believe the farther out you are from Los Angeles.
If you don't live here, if you live some other
exactly.
part of the country,
or world, I mean, the farther you go, the more people will say, yeah, that's the city where there's no transit.
Right? And of course, I started my practice 22 years ago working on the bus system of LA on an electric trolley bus project over 200 miles of boulevards, and quickly got to know the system. It's one of the most extensive bus systems in the country. The number of boardings was surpassed, I think, only by Chicago. Very, very high numbers.
It may be number one now in the U.S. I'm not sure.
It could, but I'm not sure of the numbers where it stands now. But it was a massive, extensive transit system. What people really meant was there wasn't rapid transit. There was transit, there was public transportation, but it wasn't rapid public transportation. And people have different notions of what that means. For some people, that just means a train, maybe a train underground. But there was public transportation. There was a way to get around. The trouble was it was slow, and it was in many cases seen as dangerous or dirty. It clearly had become the equivalent of a social service of a county hospital. It was transportation for the poor, for the elderly, for the handicapped, for minorities, for the so-called transit dependent. It was not
captive riders.
The captive, right? Those who had no choice, as opposed to what became the kind of mantra at LA's transit agencies and others, which were choice riders. Those were the ones who were all in their cars, because given the choice, and they weren't making an environmentally evil choice, or it wasn't morally reprehensible for most people. Economically, it just made more sense to have a car.
They needed to get to work another 2.5 hours.
To get to work, whatever. The economic balance still was very much in favor of the car. What has changed is that economic balance. Transit is extensive enough, fast enough, that it's starting to make sense, not for everybody, for more and more people to use transit. And that rebalancing is having a dramatic impact on the boulevards, as much as any other factor, I would say.
Interesting that you bring up the buses and rapid transit, because, of course, as I say, I cycled here on a boulevard. I could have taken a bus on one of those boulevards as well, but frankly, cycling was faster. You can often beat the bus. And this touches on a project you've worked on, you and your team have worked on, which is the I don't know what you say in the lingo, but the way the sort of look and feel of the Metro Rapid buses.
Sure.
And the sort of imaging and the graphics and the look and feel. I'll stick with that for now. When I first came to Los Angeles to live a couple of years ago, that was actually one of the first transit elements I noticed, was how the rapid buses looked. These big red buses going along in a straight line, and the stops that have the shelters that are unusually designed looking, shall we say, especially by the standards of Los Angeles bus stops. And that impressed me. And if I ride a bus in Los Angeles, I don't have a car, so I'm either on the trains or my bike, sometimes a bus. If I ride a bus, it's going to be one of those rapid buses. And I'm impressed by the design, the look and feel, but then I think about the fact that it's taken over a decade to kind of get part of a lane dedicated, sort of, but not really. And then it still takes an hour to get to Santa Monica on Wilshire Boulevard on one. Like, this is all great, especially the work you and your team have done, but why can't Los Angeles get in a lane? You know what I mean? Like, the most basic part of it is still missing and seems like it will always be.
Well, it's a good question. The biggest issue with transit is, do you have a dedicated path? Because we're back to path and place. If I gave a donkey cart a dedicated path, I could get it to a lot of places faster than almost any other means of transit. it's the path that is the most contested piece of it. So and in the case of Metro Rapid, which has been around for 10 years, it was for better or for worse, a form of BRT light or bus rapid transit light. There are a lot of characteristics that make up what is now called bus rapid transit, which is a kind of lower cost, effective form of transit that can be used in cities where light rail or subway is not possible or affordable. But to get BRT, there are a lot of different components. And the holy grail, the last one you get, the most expensive, the most difficult, is a dedicated lane.
And it seems like it should be the first thing. Well, it's the last thing.
Well, it's that old, it's the cliche of the low-hanging fruit. Right. Yes, it's the most important, but it's the most difficult. So sometimes it's the last. Now, here we are 10 years later, and finally, there are, I can tell you battle stories of trying to get that lane on Wilshire Boulevard. And the unbelievable pushback. I'll give you one anecdote. When Metro was considering dedicating a lane on Wilshire for the Metro Rapid, the pushback, it was only a concept. It hadn't even been approved by the board. They were talking about it. The LA City Council voted, I believe, 15-0, unanimously, to oppose it before it was stillborn, before it is beyond concept.
Which suggests what?
Well, that they had gotten enormous, by the way, not madness and, not irresponsibility. Mm-hmm. They had gotten enormous pushback from property owners, particularly commercial property owners along the boulevard, who said, think it through. It's still a car town. If you take away that curb lane, which many of our customers use for convenient parking, and instead you put a fast-moving vehicle in that lane, you will kill our businesses, particularly in Wilshire Center. The biggest opposition was in one of the densest urban areas, surprisingly, from, I think Wilshire Center is technically from Alvarado out to Western. Mm-hmm. They were reviving themselves as a business improvement district. They'd done a lot of very good things on streetscape. They'd made it very pedestrian friendly.
Please don't deliver people by rapid transit to our businesses.
But it wasn't that simple. What I learned there was it was not that simple. This was not car advocates. This was not suburbanites opposing the dedicated lane. This was actually people really interested in revitalizing the urban core. And what they were saying was, look, there's a price for the dedicated lane. We're not opposed to we love the rapid buses. They said that. We just don't want them to have a dedicated lane in this section of town. And so I began to see that these are excruciating choices. And indeed, taking away the on-street parking would, I think, most certainly have hurt them economically in the short term, because the economics of shopping and so forth, typically more affluent consumers will drive, and so on and so forth. It wasn't such a simple question. So obviously the way that cities are most effective is when they separate either vertically or horizontally. You either throw the vehicle up in the air, you dig a hole and you put it underground, or you move it behind the buildings on a separate right-of-way like light rail. But you cannot force high-speed transit on the ground along your main streets, because you will kill it in order to save it, or save it in order to, but effectively kill it.
In some ways, it makes the subway seem easier, despite all of the great difficulties of a subway.
Well, I mean, look, the subway has been proven all over the world as the single most effective way to do it.
It seems that way when I travel. I mean, I'm just back from London. The tube is pretty impressive, despite the tendency to gripe about it Londoners have.
The only problem with the subway is money. It's just so much more expensive than any other form. It's more expensive than putting it up in the air on a bridge. It's more expensive than acquiring a right-of-way, if you can, on the ground but parallel. That has all kinds of problems as well, because you're running through properties and you're at street and you have conflicts with other traffic. Subway's clearly the most effective way to deliver the rapid in rapid transit, but it's the most expensive by far. I mean, multiple times more expensive than other forms. Let me see if I'll throw out numbers. I don't even know what the latest numbers are, but I'll just to give you an idea. Subway typically, at the time, I haven't looked at them in a while, $300 to $400 million a mile. I wouldn't be surprised if it's approaching, $500 million a mile now. I'm not sure.
I feel like for the resuming of the Wilshire subway, it's like going to be twice that for the first couple miles. Like it's $1 billion for the first mile.
Yes, but if you do amortize over the whole system, let's say $500 million a mile, $500 million per mile. Light rail goes for 50, 60, 70 million a mile, maybe 30 on the low end, maybe 80 on the high end, depending on the project. We did Metro Rapid. Gosh, it's been a while. I think we did it for $500,000 a mile. So what that allowed us to do was 100 miles of system. Right. So what do you want, a mile of subway? Or 200 miles of sort of rapid buses that don't have a dedicated lane. And these are the agonizing choices that have to be made. And they were being made in a context where the public was not in favor of raising taxes for anything and so on and so forth. Of course, that's changed. This, to their credit to their, as a testament to their enormous frustration on the freeways, LA County taxpayers have repeatedly voted for tax increases to pay for better public rapid transit, and we're getting it. So the time was not right then, but now those lanes are going in on Wilshire Boulevard with relatively little opposition, as I understand it. We'll see, but it's certainly nothing compared to the opposition 10 years ago. People now understand the city's changing. The people are younger people, particularly, who aren't set in their ways, don't have a suburban house and a car. Perhaps
less. You could say less investment, even in the city. Yet
the younger people have less of investment. Well, they may have less of a financial investment. It's not to say they're any less invested, emotionally and professionally in the city. They're just living. They come with different expectations. They're okay with living in an apartment. They don't have this vision of the bungalow with a pool and a palm tree. That was what LA was selling for, a century. They think an apartment is fine. They pick an apartment near a subway line so that they
These
can
are all things I've done, by the way, so I understand.
And the people who come to my office to interview and that I talk to are doing this. They're coming with just a very different set of expectations. Part of it's economic, of just what's affordable. When I came, and I was, in my late 20s, it was cheap to rent a house in West LA and pick up an old used car. I mean, it was cheap, much cheaper than what I'd been paying to live in New York on a month-to-month basis. Economics drives so much of this, both the big investments from the city, but also the individual choices that people make. And, those of us who've been looking for a long time, we can see this sea change. Some people still don't get it, and they don't understand why the subway isn't coming to their front door in Brentwood. And it's like, look, we cannot design a subway system to serve.
You want to pay that $1 billion for your mile.
You want to pay for it. But, these systems are not designed for the most affluent who have the most choices. These systems are designed to serve the most number of people at the most reasonable cost. And that means that some people who choose to live in more isolated areas won't have the kind of access that people who are willing to live in denser areas and in apartments and so forth will have. They will have more transit freedom, more transit choices.
You mentioned coming to Los Angeles in the early 80s, and I hear a lot about that time. I hear a lot about that time being an optimistic one with the Olympics and all that. And some people say it was the best time they remember in Los Angeles, but they'll also say it was a time when people couldn't necessarily they could be optimistic, but not necessarily about changes in the form of Los Angeles. The sense of, yeah, sure, they'll build transit one day, right? Like nothing could ever be a weird combination of optimism in general and then the idea that nothing could ever change in Los Angeles. So given that feeling, and if you think, whether you think it existed or not, let me know, but what still appealed to you about Los Angeles? What still fascinated you enough to stay here, focus on it, to write Los Angeles Boulevard in the first edition, even if it seemed like, well, it's not a great urban form we have, and we're probably stuck with it?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, because it makes me realize we haven't talked about architecture. You asked me what had interested me on the boulevards, and I want to get back to the role of architecture in a city like this. But I think what you're getting at is a bit sort of public versus private. And in the early 80s, I think there was a feeling, at least my sense was, that a lot of exciting things were happening in the private realm, certainly in architecture. Frank Gehry and the whole LA school was exploding, and that's part of what drew me here. And there were wonderful houses and shops and small office buildings, but this was all in the private sector.
But no less exciting for it.
No less exciting for it, but it wasn't creating a public realm. I mean, that's really more than anything what got me thinking, could we ever build enough of these little things to affect the public realm? Jane Jacobs, I think mistakenly, said LA is a city with no public life. It's all privatized. And I think that, like many of the cliches, was overstated and not true. It had a long-standing tradition of public realm that had been dimmed and somewhat lost, or an increasingly privatized public realm. The Music Center was a kind of perfect example. We'll build a great public performing arts center, but we'll kind of put it up on a hill. And I think the Getty is another example. That's actually private, but it's up on a hill. It's very public in some ways. It's free. It's remarkable, but it's removed from public space in other ways.
It's a very much representative of Los Angeles in that way. I mean, there's lots of stuff not to be crazy about the Getty, but it does encapsulate something.
It's extra. It's the city of, you have to sort of, it will defy expectations of what we would expect in a European or even an East Coast city, but it's still so rich and so fascinating. There is this strong tendency to build enclaves, and I think that enclave instinct, we're finally overcoming it, but everything got built with its own defined border as sort of a mini campus, kind of apart, rather than each piece contributing to the public realm. Well, the public realm would have been the boulevards, but they weren't seen as a shared public space that each building contributes something to. Most of the architecture on the boulevards most of the newer architecture from the 60s and 70s was pretty disappointing. A lot of it, not all. The older architecture in the 20s and 30s was reflective of something more urban, more public, and was kind of wonderful. So there was this anomaly of this modern city whose modern architecture wasn't great on the boulevards. And what I had dreamed of seeing, and which I'm seeing now, is that LA would find its own urban public language. The city I had in mind was Amsterdam, which in the 30s there was this kind of explosion with a group of architects who were building very public work and who sort of created this, what was called the Amsterdam School. And I sort of hoped that LA would. When I got here, the LA School was still doing very quirky kind of private work. But now it's extraordinary. First of all, this city probably has the largest concentration of architectural talent in the world. And the buildings that are going up are so oriented towards public space, towards the boulevards. There is a boulevard architecture that has emerged in LA that's wonderful. It's just exciting. And it isn't quite there yet in terms of clinching the publicness of those public spaces, but it's happening. When you mentioned 83, I think I got here in 83. The turning point in certain perceptions was the Olympics in 84. In 84, the Olympics plus the opening of MOCA and then the opening of the Anderson Wing at LACMA. And the New York art world, this is among the certain, this is among the sort of cognoscenti, but they set opinions. They do, from New York, reputations were set, including city reputations. And LA's reputation really shifted after 84 as now, instead of a joke, a cultural joke, as a serious center for art, for creative production, not just movies. And I was struck last week reading about the Ace Hotel, and I think opening up, and that's 30 years later. And I really think the Ace Hotel, that, I may be wrong, I may be overstating it, but it seems to me that more than, Disney Hall, yes, and Staples Center, yes, and some of the loft renovations, all of it have been trending that way. But the Ace Hotel seems to me to have now cinched all of these things for downtown, specifically for downtown as a kind of almost unstoppable, vibrant urban district. It took an old building that they've been trying to turn around. Since I started working here, it's like, what are we going to do with the theaters on Broadway? Well, now, and it required subsidies and pleading, and now a for-profit venture has taken over, done a spectacular job with renewing it, has restaurants and performance and hotels, and it's happening. And I think for that, and the ACE, of course, is coming from your part of the world, from the Northwest, and yes. I think it's only the seventh one. And, not that LA should be seventh in line, but I think the fact they could go anywhere and that they picked downtown LA, South Broadway, is remarkable. I think that will go down as truly a kind of powerful statement about the return of downtown LA. It's been coming, and the success of downtown is a kind of overnight sensation that's taken 50 years. I mean, since redevelopment began, American redevelopment as a legal process began on Bunker Hill over 50 years ago. It's taken so long for downtown to come back, and the skepticism was enormous. So I think that's emblematic of also what's happening on the boulevards. A renewed enthusiasm, a renewed market, a renewed economy for urban public space, walkable, transit-oriented. The mantras that we've been hearing about. But now it isn't just us kind of dreamy design and planning folks who are talking about it. It's the money is there. And that means that economics is what sustains urban trends.
On which boulevards have you seen the most emergence of this Los Angeles public language? Are there particular ones where you've seen more change than others over the past 30 years?
Oh, gosh. It's like everything in LA, a lot of it's fragmentary and sort of mosaic and patchwork-like. So it's bits and pieces here and there. Certainly Wilshire is the one where you look, because Wilshire does tend to set trends, but you see it on boulevards, you see it on Ventura Boulevard and sections of it. Again, it's rare. It tends to be in concentrated places, which is good. And then not much is happening. You can still drive long stretches where it doesn't look a whole lot different than it did 30 years ago. So this is but that kind of pulsing of sort of intensity and then not so much is characteristic of cities with rapid transit, because there's always a kind of concentration of development intensity around the stations. We're seeing that now. The work in Culver City along Washington Boulevard and Culver Boulevard is remarkable. I guess I could come up with my list. You're just seeing it everywhere. I think what's so remarkable is that it's not limited as it used to be to a few boulevards where, for example, the redevelopment agency might have declared a redevelopment area. So, for example, on Lankershim, you saw a lot because it was a redevelopment area. So that was by policy pumping money into certain places. Now it's like the popcorn's starting to pop everywhere. You see it in bits and pieces on all the boulevards. You look for it. What am I talking about? I'm talking about housing in particular. That's always been the last step. There hasn't been, much new housing on the boulevards for generations. In the Hollywood in the 20s and 30s, lots of people lived in those, wonderful chateau-like apartments, yes. and that was what you did. And then it stopped, and nobody wanted to live on a boulevard. They really became more and more exclusively commercial or industrial, and then
criminal in some cases.
Criminal, and certainly not residential, and more car-oriented. To see. I wondered 30 years ago and 20 years ago, who will be willing to live on the boulevard? Now, we knew you could put affordable housing there for people who didn't have choices, and fair or not, when the land was available, there tended to be housing for seniors, a lot of senior housing on the boulevard, 3rd Street and over by and your Melrose, La Brea in that area, a lot of senior housing. Other people who wouldn't necessarily have many choices, there was housing for that.
The buses of housing.
Exactly. But now what you're seeing is market rate housing on the boulevards, and it's extraordinary. So but what I see is the quality of the design and the architecture of those buildings is kind of wonderful, in many cases really interesting, and they have most importantly shops on the ground floor. that are really important contributors. Now, sometimes the retail doesn't work, or it's not the right kind of retail, or it's just fast food, or whatever it is, rather than neighborhood serving.
It is a Subway sandwich shop rather than a subway station.
Right. Well said. Or a shop, or a tax preparation firm rather than a dry cleaner. I mean, rather than something that you would use on a daily or weekly basis.
Or those tax preparers. They're never a good sign when a neighborhood is like mostly those, right?
Well, they're definitely, people who look at this, they're definitely types of retail which are barometers of where neighborhoods are going.
Foot clinics and that sort of thing.
Right. In other words, they're the kind. Well, I remember my office was on Wilshire in the Miracle Mile for many years, and there were just a lot of wig shops there because they.
What is the story with that? I've long wondered.
Why? Who knows?
And they're huge.
They're big, and it's always economics, and sometimes, and often, and this goes back to the medieval marketplace, where all the goldsmiths were on one street and all the sort of pork purveyors were on another. They specialized by type of product. So there's often an economics to that, because if someone wants to do comparison shopping, it makes sense for them to be together. But, that was fine for those businesses and their customers, but it did very little for people living in the neighborhood. So you want to make sure that...
I live in the wig district. Isn't that cool?
Maybe once every few years you might make a purchase there, but meanwhile what it was doing was preventing the kinds of businesses that would make it a livable neighborhood, which, it's branch bank and a cleaners and a grocery store and whatever it is that people need for their daily needs, where they can walk and fulfill those without having to get in a car. So that's changing as well. You talk about Santa Monica. I mean, there are boulevards that slow down once they get to Santa Monica because they're about to hit the cliffs. So they become more like just downtown. Even though they're boulevards in name, they kind of slow down to...
The hand of God stops them from... Slow down.
Well, they enter the Santa Monica grid, and, I think in the boulevards, it's been so long, but I call them sort of strands and grids. I mean, the boulevard sometimes is just this sole strand between areas. But as it goes through Beverly Hills, or goes through Santa Monica, or through Pasadena, or Culver City, they become part of a web that's working not just in one direction, but in two directions, and become part of a downtown, a vibrant web of activity. And so they kind of have to slow down. They become something else. And then they may break out on the other side and turn back into high-speed boulevards.
So how do your motivations compare, the motivations for writing Los Angeles Boulevard in the late 80s and for reissuing and expanding it now? Are they similar impulses, or do you feel different about the book now than you did then?
Oh gosh, my feelings about the book. It's been out. I wrote it when I was young and just had arrived in LA, and there was a chance for me to sort of summarize my thoughts about cities in general and about LA in particular. I knew that, I would not frequently, but every now and then get a request, how can I get the book? And I'd have to say to people, gosh, it's long out of print. And people would, I knew that in architecture schools, people would photocopy. There were photocopies that went around.
Why was it so long out of print? It seems like Los Angeles books have kind of a life to them, usually. Why was this one
Well, it
not?
was published thanks to the Los Angeles Forum for Architecture and Urban Design, which had a pamphlet series. It was really not even a book. It was just a mere pamphlet. It was, I can't remember, the fourth or fifth in the pamphlet series, which had been inspired, I think, by Stephen Holl's pamphlet series in New York. And we had a limited budget. I don't know what, we got a grant for $10,000 or something. We printed up 1,500 copies, beautifully printed, gorgeous printing job. And, but they were gone. And, there was no market that I knew of to bring it out again. And I moved on and started my career in practice. And, but the forum had several times said, well, we should reissue it because it's one of our, it's one of the pamphlets that's had an influence, and people asked for it. And what do you think about republishing it? So I had given it some thought, but now 25th anniversary seemed like now or never, because it wasn't going to be around probably for the 50th anniversary. So I thought, okay, let's do it now, and it was an opportunity. It started out as just a simple reissue, but I actually doubled the length of the book because there's a whole new second half in which I reflected on 25 years of working, in effect, on boulevards as a practicing architect and urban designer, and the lessons that I've learned through practice, and how they differ or reinforce some of the thoughts that I had as a kid in the original book. So people can hopefully, find it interesting and amusing even to see what the 28-year-old thought of boulevards, and then what the 58-year-old now thinks about them in terms of the practice that we've had on projects, not just in LA, but in other parts of the country and the world as well.
And in this new section of the book, in Los Angeles Boulevard, the 25th anniversary edition, you do write about your childhood trips to Hartford, your current work with Hartford. Both of our generations in America grew up in suburban areas. I think both of us personally did as well. Tell me what those trips to Hartford were like for you, how they were illuminating about both the way you were growing up as a kid and the sort of potential adult life you could have.
You mean the trips to downtown Hartford from the suburbs when I was a kid? Or
exactly.
Oh.
Well, I mean, talk about both, but start with the kid and go on to the child father to the man.
Right. Well, certainly. I mean, I think, now that I have kids and I look at how they're growing up, we are definitely shaped by our environment, what we think is normal, what we think is positive, what we don't like. So I think as designers, we have an interest and responsibility in thinking about, what environment did I grow up in? How does that affect my thinking? Also to make sure it doesn't put blinders on and opens you up to people who've come from very different experiences. Mine was a sort of typical American kind of middle-class suburban upbringing in a freestanding house with lots of green around and with a kind of town center couple of miles away, and then a major city center, downtown Hartford, about 4 or 5 miles away. And as kids, we were, driven into downtown to go to the department store and to go to the dentist and the doctor. There were a number of things which you could only get in the downtown. But this was late 1950s, early 1960s, and those services are starting to migrate out to the suburbs. So we're starting to go downtown less and less because now there's a department store out at the new mall and so forth. So I lived through that kind of transition where what is remaining in the center cities, which was not much except, business and poverty to some increasing. It was the pattern.
Old people, too.
Well, yes, and certain populations, but there had been a huge outmigration of a lot of resources, of a lot of people, and now increasingly shopping and commerce as well.
They couldn't sustain life anymore by themselves.
No, and it was a downward spiral. I mean, it was a period of clear decline in cities from New York all the way down to smaller cities. So I lived through that, and in fact, right near us was an iconic move. Hartford was the insurance capital of the country. It had all the corporations downtown. Connecticut General hired Skidmore, Owings & Merrill to design a gorgeous new suburban campus just half a mile from my house. And that was emblematic of the corporate departure from downtown. So downtowns were bleeding in some respects. But what was coming in was things like Army Navy stores and head shops and record stores, and the counterculture was moving into some of those abandoned storefronts to create a sort of vibrant kind of cafe culture. So when I was maybe 10 or 11, I was allowed to take the bus into downtown, and this was not a red rapid bus. This was a rumbling old local bus into down Albany Avenue, which was kind of boulevard in Hartford. And I just loved getting off and just wandering around downtown. So I've often thought that that's where my fascination with cities and public space and public life began, because it was scary. There were things in the downtown area and people who seemed intimidating to a kid, who were different, but there were also kind of wonderful things too that you couldn't find out in the suburbs. Old buildings and the department stores and music shops where I could get sheet music that wasn't available in the kind of conventional suburban stores. Mm-hmm. So cities became very alluring, unique, special places that created excitement. I mean, even when you're scared, you're a little excited. Yes. And especially. And there was also the positive excitement of the kind of wonder How did they make those buildings? So, that's where that interest was born, and I carry it to this day. And as you're alluding to, I had just the joy of the last 5 years of being invited back to my hometown, downtown Hartford, to work with major cultural organizations there and the city there to continue the work of helping to revitalize that downtown. It's been an ongoing process, like downtown LA. As we said, these things are not done overnight. At least in most cases, they don't happen overnight. But I think they are at the proverbial tipping point. I think they're very close to. They have a significant downtown residential population that is about to grow, probably to double, and that tends to make all the difference. So it's been wonderful and exciting to go back home and help there.
It reminds me of the sort of 2-hour bike trips I would take as a kid from Redmond, Washington to Seattle. Grew up in Redmond or lived there, which is a classic suburb where Microsoft is. I guess people might know it that way, but then Seattle, a completely different animal. And to this day, I think a lot about, I don't go back there that much, but I think, what would I want for Seattle? There's many things. Seattle's more backward than people think. I mean, it's got that Space Needle, but they have work to do. What do you want for Hartford?
Well, I think I want for Hartford what I want for any city that we work in, which is, the core for me is the just deep human beauty of active public space. Because when it works, it really belongs to everybody. And people, no matter what challenges they may be facing in their life, if you come to a public space that's working well, where everybody's welcome, everybody can share the space and get along without any excessive conflict, there's something that happens there that just doesn't happen in any other aspect of life. And it's the sort of, to me, it's the jewel of what cities offer. I mean, they obviously offer many, many other things, but many they can also offer very negative things. And I've seen this in cities all over the world, and there's something sort of universal about that. That's so basic. I sort of joke that it's all sort of in a cup of coffee. If you look, we sort of have a little specialty where we look at cafes as really little harbingers of this kind of human connectedness. And you see coffee being served in cities, neighborhoods, districts around the world, poor, rich, black, white, Asian, Western. The notion of gathering, it's really just about human gathering at some fundamental level. Now, there are all kinds of ways to gather, and some good, some not so good. Gathering in public space for me is just one of the highest goods that we can achieve. It doesn't always happen. It doesn't just happen. It really it evolves through kind of cultural impulse and direct physical intervention, and that's sort of what we do. We help foster that where there's an interest, or enlighten people about why it might be a good thing. Usually it's not a hard sell. Most people get it more and more. I think it had been sort of forgotten in this country. It used to be a harder sell. 30 years ago, talking about public space in LA, people would look at you with a little bit of a puzzled look. And not people who had traveled a lot, and you'd say, well, where'd you go last summer? They say, oh, well, we had a great trip to Europe, or I went maybe just up to Vancouver, and say, well, did you like that? So then they go, well, that was great, but that's not LA. And I say, well, don't be so sure. And I think we do have an incredible sort of public life now, and increasingly we have public spaces to support that public life. So I'm optimistic about LA.
We've alluded to that phenomenon where the farther away someone is, the less they know about Los Angeles, and the more sure they are about the myths that they've accrued over the years about Los Angeles. What do you think other cities stand to gain if they know better Los Angeles's experience, its good experience and its bad experience over the past 30 years? If they understood more what does go on here, what has gone on here, what's gone up and down in Los Angeles, what would they learn?
Oh, it's a good question. I mean, The one thing to say about LA is it's just a harder city to get to know. It's just harder. Some cities are easy. They're compact and they're kind of clear, and they sort of have one very strong direction, and you go and you can kind of get a taste of them. And
we can't all be Copenhagen.
What's that?
We can't all be Copenhagen.
No, we can't all be Copenhagen. It's just a hard city to get to know. Partly because of the sprawl, partly because it's hard. It's increasingly a hard city to drive, and to cover a lot of it, you have to drive, and it's intimidating for many people who. How do I get around? How can I even see this place? How can I know it?
Yes. Where are you? Where are you going? What time of day are you going? Your answer is going to be different.
It's very complicated, and so I think that's part of the reason for a lot of the misunderstanding is that people come, or they're ready cliches that people who are a little bit lazy of mind are willing to sort of hold on to.
88 suburbs in search of a city, let me tell you.
Right. I mean, you've heard them all. But what's so surprising is how surprising the city is. I think it's if you have a chance to take someone around, you can see the response of surprise is the most common one. Oh, I had no idea LA was like this, or wow, this wasn't what I expected. I think it's anyone who digs beyond the surface and who doesn't have a miserable experience just driving, from the Santa Monica Pier to Universal City Walk at 5 on a Friday afternoon, and they'll think, I hate this city. Of course, we can probably concoct a bad scenario in just about any city. Yes. Maybe LA, it's a little bit easier to have a bad scenario if you hit it wrong, if your timing is bad.
Don't spend all day at Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco either.
Exactly.
As long as we're getting tips.
Exactly. But San Francisco, just walk. I mean, the cities that have the advantage are where you can just. You push your friends out the bus door and say, just walk all day and it'll be great. And there are many cities where that's all you have to do. I mean, in Paris, you can just wander for hours and it will be fantastic. LA is not like that. You have to be more deliberate. It's harder. You have to sort of go from place to place. It's not as easy to know. San Francisco, you can wander. Right. But I don't think San Francisco is as interesting as LA. But it's a lot easier to have a kind of great San Francisco experience. So what could they learn? I mean, we were talking about China before, and before we turned the mic on, and when I went 6 years ago, my message was, look, I'm brand new to China. I've never been. I'm here just to have my eyes and ears open and to learn. And the last thing I want to do is lecture you, but I do have one message. Please don't do what we did.
Yes.
Don't make the mistakes. You have a chance to you're doing so much, and if you build an automobile-dependent urban structure in your major cities, you'll be digging out from it for a generation.
How many cities listen to that? It seems like some just say, we want it to.
Well, in China, it's very interesting. I mean, again, I always look. Jane Jacobs tells us follow the money. It's always about the economics. And one of the interesting things about China is that China owns all of the automobile manufacturing companies, so that it has a vested interest in selling a lot of cars. Mm-hmm. That's at odds with environmentalists in China who understand that, it's damaging to the environment. It can be culturally damaging. So there are built-in conflicts in Chinese policy, but I think the environmental agenda is now prevailing because the pollution is so bad. Mm-hmm. Japan's such an interesting model because Japan developed its car industry, but the land is so tight because it's an island that they developed it for export. It's like, well, we'll make the cars and send them elsewhere. We'll have great public transportation and high-speed trains. Which they do. So, that's a different model. So, from LA, the mistake would be, be careful about the allure of the single-family house and the car and the freeway. They have wonderful qualities to it, but in moderation and with careful thought and in balance. It's all about balance. It's not reject the car. It's not reject the house or reject the suburb. But it's as with most things, it's about figuring out what the right balance is in terms of density, transit, walkability, and housing. And ultimately, it has a lot to do with housing type. Some cultures are all about houses, and some cultures are all about apartments. And, you have to, the model I look at is, the French decided in the late 1870s that they would become an apartment culture to a large extent. England and the states decided we'll be a house culture. I mean, that's obviously an oversimplification, but in terms of the ideal of the home, Paris sort of reinvented the idea of the apartment as the model of where you want it to live, and the urbanism follows that. Those cultural, when we talk about the American dream, we can't get a bus lane on Wilshire Boulevard because the American dream is predicated on a single-family house with a garden. That means sprawl, that means cars, that means...
It's a demanding dream.
Yeah, it is. It has... People don't understand, I think, always, increasingly, I think people do understand that their choice is involved and there's a price to be paid. Mm-hmm. So... what we're seeing now is a switch in the sort of ideal of the home, particularly among young people. And people say it started with friends where, they were living in an apartment and a great apartment, an apartment probably no one could, that never existed. But the notion that apartment life.
Yeah, in the 1990s.
Yeah, in the 90s. And Seinfeld as well set up an alternative to the suburban home as the kind of ideal model for living, certainly for young people. And I think that we see that being played out now. There's a huge market for apartments, not because people don't like a garden or like the privacy of a home, but they understand what the trade-offs are, and they're not interested.
And finally, for someone who doesn't live here yet, a first-timer in Los Angeles, disoriented, as we say, doesn't know where to go, how to go, whatever way they're getting around, be it car, bike, bus, train, I would say the boulevards still are the most useful psychological framework to organize the city for yourself. I take it you would agree with that?
I'd agree they're the most useful after the mountains.
After the mountains.
And the ocean.
The geography and then the boulevards.
Is so present in L.A. that really the spine of the Hollywood Hills out to the Santa Monica Mountains, or if you're in the valley, the San Gabriels, I mean, you have that orientation. The place you have at least is when you're kind of in the middle of the grid and you're furthest away, where they're...
Rainer Banham's Plains of Id?
The Plains of Id, where there seems to be...
Where I live.
There's no orientation. Well, Koreatown, I think you can still see the hills far enough to orient you, but not so much. But yes.
In Banham's day, the smog was going to be getting in the way of that.
That's true. And now they're remarkably visible almost all year long. So we do, and that's kind of one of the joys of LA is the sort of presence of geography. But yes, beyond that, I think the boulevards are very good for orientation. Of course, they're the spines. People still use the freeways. That's fine. They're sort of regional scale orientation devices, but they tell you nothing about what the fine grain of LA is like. And for that, you have to get down to the boulevard, and then you have to get out of the car and walk. And what always amazes me is how different the exact same block will seem when sitting behind the driving wheel of a car and then when walking on the sidewalk. It's just a different place. And so that's fine. I mean, both are interesting. I think you can design a street that is appealing from the car. That's fine. But the priority should be to make it great to be on foot and to get people out of the car. It's not that they have to get rid of their car even. Just get them out in ways that make economic sense, that are convenient, and that create a kind of social benefit, a pleasurable experience, a coming together with other people that you just cannot get. I'll end with just, an anecdote. I mean, I've been walking my kids to my elementary school for 9 years, and it was a joyous sort of public space gathering on the campus every morning, and we'd see friends and they'd see their friends. And it was really as vibrant a kind of social gathering as any Italian piazza you could name. And kids playing, kicking the soccer ball, and parents with their coffee mugs, and it was a wonderful experience. My kids are now at middle and high school where we have to drive them every day. And this morning I was at my middle school and I saw two of the friends that I used to see on foot walking in the yard. But I waved to them, but the reflections on my windshield and on theirs meant that they couldn't see me, and I could have no conversation with them. And to me, I thought, I hate what driving does, not even in terms of the city, but in terms of separating me from other people. Walking makes a level of human contact possible that really American graffiti notwithstanding, yes, perhaps on a Friday night where people are cruising with the windows down and the tops down, maybe there can be some interaction between cars.
In 1960.
In 1960. But today, it's too dangerous. So it really struck home how isolating the car is and how it really, it limits the enrichment of our lives that walking and gathering can provide.
Well, I heard a song once that said nobody walks in Los Angeles, so that's what I'll believe forever. No, just kidding. It's what you won't believe if you think more about the boulevards and if you read the book Los Angeles Boulevard, 8 X-Rays of the Body Public, by Doug Suisman, who I've been speaking to this hour here in Santa Monica. He is also the founder and principal of Suisman Urban Design. Doug, thanks so much.
It was my pleasure, Colin. Thanks for having me.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanaugh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Treher, Thomas Interberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.